Imagine waking up one morning and having to pay your biggest competitor $1 billion. Then the government fines you $150 million. And finally, your CEO of 18 years bails on you. Well, if you're Adobe, you don't have to imagine. Adobe used to be beloved by Wall Street and creative professionals alike. Now both have left the company to die. But what went wrong? How could such a large company with a near monopoly in their sector fall so far? Let's get right into it. Adobe was founded in the early 1980s and immediately began attracting attention. Steve Jobs even tried to buy the company in its first year of operations, but the founders refused. Adobe focused on selling its Illustrator software and realized it had hit a gold mine. During the 90s, Adobe went on an acquisition spree, purchasing Photoshop, FrameMaker, and After Effects to build out its creative suite. During this time, users would pay a one-time fee and be given a license to Adobe software. But this would soon change. In 2011, CEO Shantanu Narayan tested the waters with a $600 per year subscription to Adobe Creative Cloud. And in 2013, he went all in. Adobe announced that from now on, users would be unable to buy their software outright. Instead, they'd be forced to pay a subscription to access the Adobe Creative Suite. Some users were actually happy with this transition. Instead of paying tons of money up front for software they've never used, they can sign up for a subscription to test it out. If they don't like it, they can just cancel the subscription. Wall Street was a huge fan as well. Offering subscriptions made Adobe's revenue much more predictable and consistent, and the stock soared over 600% in the coming years. But no one could have expected how scummy Adobe's subscriptions would be. On their website, Adobe offers users 3 options. You can pay a monthly subscription, a standard annual subscription, but in the middle there's an even cheaper monthly subscription. Who in their right mind wouldn't take that deal? Well, that's exactly what Adobe was hoping you'd think. This middle deal is actually an annual subscription that bills you monthly. Really, they're hoping that users who just want to test Adobe products accidentally sign up for a yearly subscription. And once you sign up, they'll make sure you pay. If you want to cancel the subscription that you were tricked into signing up for, you'll have to pay 50% of your remaining balance up front. Adobe hides this fact, and users are often unpleasantly surprised when they try to cancel their subscriptions. Not only that, but there's no easy way to stop your plan from auto-renewing. Users reported instances of thinking that they had canceled their subscription, only to continue to be billed for months after. So, you've got a company that tricks you into signing up for a subscription that you didn't want and doesn't let you leave unless you pay a fee. That's pretty scummy. Once upon a time, you could just pay a one-time fee and own the software on your computer. But companies like Adobe learned that there's more money in scamming people rather than offering a useful product. Investors were happy as Adobe made more money than ever. But soon, the government took notice. In June of 2024, the FTC filed a lawsuit against Adobe, alleging the company had steered users towards a more expensive subscription plan while hiding cancellation fees. Adobe tried to defend itself by saying that subscriptions offer a flexible and cost-effective way for users to access their software, but the FTC wasn't buying it. The lawsuit was settled out of court in March 2026, with Adobe agreeing to pay a $150 million fine. Then, later that same week, Adobe's CEO for the past 18 years announced his resignation. But what's worse than a $150 million fee? Well, how about a $1 billion fee? Before we go any further, I'd like to know, how do you feel about Adobe? Do you use any Adobe products? I personally use DaVinci Resolve to edit these videos for free, so I don't see the point of an Adobe subscription. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Acquisitions have always been a critical part of Adobe's corporate playbook. Photoshop and After Effects were both independent companies before they were folded into Adobe's product suite. Many of these products have grown tremendously under Adobe's corporate umbrella, but some of these acquisitions were more about killing competition rather than innovation. In 1994, Adobe acquired Aldus Corporation, the company behind Freehand, a direct competitor to Illustrator. But very quickly, the FTC stepped in and told Adobe that it had to divest Freehand to preserve competition in the creative software industry. Freehand was sold to another company called Macromedia, and the story seemed to be settled. But in 2005, Adobe tried again. Adobe acquired Macromedia in 2005, and the FTC didn't raise any alarms. Soon, Adobe began slowly pushing users to their Illustrator software instead. Eventually, Adobe completely stopped upgrading freehand and left it to die. Then, in 2007, Adobe officially pulled the plug on freehand. Many former freehand users were furious and demanded that Adobe open source the software instead of just leaving it to rot. But when you're a multi-billion-dollar company, you don't have to listen to customers. Just like that, Adobe had killed its biggest competitor. But the 2010s would bring much more competition. Flashy VC-backed startups like Canva and Figma began to take market share from Adobe's creative suite. So, Adobe knew something had to be done. First, they tried to compete by launching Adobe XD. Adobe XD was a UI/UX design platform built to go head-to-head with Figma. But customers weren't impressed. Adobe XD required a download, while Figma was easily accessible in a browser. That friction of downloading an app made users much more willing to test out Figma instead. XD was also hurt by the Adobe ecosystem. Users weren't really interested in testing out the millionth Adobe product, but were curious about a new competitor. But the biggest mistake was on collaboration. One of Figma's biggest selling points was that they had easy, real-time collaboration on their projects, allowing teams to work faster and more efficiently. Adobe XD only added this feature months after launch. By then, it was too late. Figma exploded once the network effect took over, and Adobe knew it had lost. But they still had one more trick up their sleeve. Loaded with cash from their new subscription business model, Adobe agreed to acquire Figma for $20 billion in 2022. Adobe desperately wanted to absorb Figma's powerful design workflow and shut down any competing services. But almost immediately, officials in the UK and EU filed to stop the deal. They'd seen Adobe's pattern of killing competition and knew it couldn't happen again. The two sides fought in court for 15 months, but in the end, Adobe lost again. As a result of the failed merger, Adobe had to pay Figma a $1 billion breakup fee. Not only did this hurt Adobe's balance sheet, but it gave one of their biggest competitors a massive influx of cash. But Adobe and Figma were about to be crushed by a force bigger than both of them combined. Once ChatGPT and other AI companies began offering image generation, Adobe knew that their core business was facing its biggest competition yet. This wasn't another photo editing software, it was a product that allowed anyone to generate professional-grade images with the right prompts. So, they released Adobe Firefly in early 2023. Firefly allows users to modify and generate images using Adobe's proprietary AI, or with a third-party model from companies like OpenAI. Adobe customers could now generate designs and edit them faster than ever. But soon, people noticed something. In the terms of service, Adobe said that Firefly has access to the content you upload, and that it will use machine learning to improve services. Users thought that Adobe was stealing their images and using it to train their AI. Although Adobe said this wasn't the case, the public's trust was already broken. OpenAI and ChatGPT weren't necessarily trained to compete with Photoshop directly. They managed to release software that reduced the need for manual photo editing completely. Firefly was more of an assistive tool, while Gemini and ChatGPT allowed full image generation through prompting. On top of that, products like Claude Design and Google Stitch rendered Adobe Firefly completely obsolete for most UI professionals. Claude and Gemini allowed users to create basic designs with prompting. Then, the models could turn the designs into fully working prototypes in minutes. Adobe might have the upper hand in editing software, but this was something it could never hope to compete with. At the end of the day, why would someone choose a software that can only make designs over one that can generate a fully functional prototype? On top of that, companies that are already paying for a Claude or Gemini subscription will be tempted to shift more spend to those tools instead of forking over more money to Adobe. But Adobe and Figma aren't the only companies being crushed by AI. ChatGPT just caused a company's stock to fall by 50% in a single day. Now, a multi-billion-dollar business is on the brink of collapse. So, if you want to learn how ChatGPT killed Chegg, click the video on screen.